This is not a baseball story, but it is an infinite inning story, and I appreciate your allowing me to tell it. There are a couple of threads I want to bring together here. I've mentioned the comic strip Skippy a number of times on the show. It ran from the 1920s into the mid-1940s. It's one of my many obsessions that fall into the category of very cool old things that have been mostly forgotten. It was massively popular in its day. It spun off a ton of merchandising. Its author, Percy Crosby, wrote prose novels about the characters. There were 2 movies that were adapted from it, both very successful. And yeah, the name of the strip was lifted without compensation by the peanut butter people, or so Crosby and his heirs have long believed. The initial logos were pretty much identical, which is a big clue. To me, it seems pretty similar to the whole Babe Ruth, Baby Ruth candy bar thing, except that the peanut butter pirates didn't work as hard to disguise they're trying to steal someone else's IP. As you probably know, the makers of the Baby Ruth candy bar claim that they were inspired by Ruth Cleveland, beloved daughter of former President Grover Cleveland, who was not exactly a hot topic at that moment, given that she had been dead about 17 years at that point. Percy Crosby was no mere cartoonist, not to take anything away from cartoonists whose work I love very much, but he was a versatile artist with a lot to say, and so he painted and drew other things besides his comic strip, including editorial cartoons and some things that were just thoughtful. I'm looking at one right now from January 1937. It depicts a boy and a girl in silhouette as they walk along a country lane beneath a full moon. The boy is gesturing excitedly. The girl is just listening, perhaps, or maybe plotting her escape. I don't know, but given the title, I think the story is supposed to be sentimental, marking the beginning of something, not its ending. The title is Supreme Moments in Life, and the legend says, taking your girl home from the Tuesday night public lecture during the full harvest moon. And he was dead on about that. The first time I was bold enough to walk a girl I had a crush on home from school was when I was in the 6th grade. And when that went well, good gosh, I felt like I was 20 feet tall that day. It really was a supreme moment in life. One of Crosby's more pointed pieces appeared on the cover of the March 24th, 1935 edition of The American Weekly, which was a newspaper supplement that appeared in Hearst newspapers, kind of similar to Parade, except with more sex in it. The piece is titled Childhood Tragedies, and Crosby painted a boy kneeling in prayer at the side of his bed, face buried in his arms, feet bare, trousers patched. The caption says, "Dear Lord, please make Mama and Papa stop fighting, 'cause it's hard to take sides when you love them both, and besides, I'm ashamed to face the kids." This caused a mild sensation, a stir, a tremor in the force. We can exaggerate those things. Have you ever watched Singin' in the Rain? Of course you have, one of the top 100 films of all time. At about the 1/3 mark of the film, there's an interminable number, beautiful girls, like all the songs in the movie. It's carried over from a film in the 1930s, but unlike the rest of the songs in the movie, all of which serve it really well, this one causes it to grind to a halt. It's the only flaw, in my opinion, in this film, and the number is only there to show you what Debbie Reynolds has been up to since we last saw her in the story, and that is apparently standing around in the background of this number as it's being filmed. And the song stops for a little fashion show. Actresses playing statues as they model outfits, though some are shaking really badly, show off these various outfits as the singer describes what they're wearing. And at one point he says, "A string of pearls with a suit of tweed. It started quite a riot." Going back to when I first saw the film as a kid, which might have been around the same time I walked that girl home from school, I'd think, really? A riot? I'd have a hard time believing it caused a mild susurration. But then I'd think, well, that's not a world you're very interested in, fashion. Maybe within that sphere it caused quite a riot. But I wouldn't believe it. Riot is a pretty strong word. I believe that some people might have said, or interesting. That's mostly what people say anyway, because they don't have that much on their minds. Descriptive words escape them. Show them Picasso's Guernica, and they'll say, interesting. Lewis and Clark looking over the Great Plains for the first time. Interesting. J. Robert Oppenheimer at the Trinity test. The first atomic bomb goes off. Interesting. And somebody nudged him and they said, really? And he said, I'm sorry, that was inadequate. I had it here somewhere in my jacket pocket. I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. That's what I meant to say. Forget the interesting part. And so they took away his security clearance, just like it shows in the movie. Despite my skepticism, there was a reaction to Crosby's painting. A lot of people wrote into the Hearst papers and said, can I get a copy of that? And apparently free of charge, they distributed a whole lot of color versions of the piece, which is kind of odd if you think about it. I mean, this was not the first drawing of a kitten dangling from a branch under the heading, hang in there. This was a very manipulative polemic against divorce. And why did so many people need it? Now, some people wanted it, which is a different matter, but in terms of people just wanting to have it around, maybe stick it on the icebox, it seems like an odd subject for that, unless you had divorce on your mind in the first place. I don't necessarily mean for oneself. I'd almost guess that those who were requesting it for civilian purposes, and you'll see what I mean by that in a second, wanted to have it around to make themselves feel superior. You see, this is what I've always been saying. These selfish people don't consider the children. Americans have always hated divorce. I don't know if there are cultures that like it, but there have been some that have had more forgiving attitudes towards it. For example, allowing it to be initiated by either husband or wife. Conversely, the Catholic Church, of course, has always been against it. The United States was founded primarily by Protestants, but despite the whole Henry VIII thing, our English heritage was also very restrictive about divorce. There was certainly a taboo against it here until relatively recent times, and I'm not deeply versed in the origin of those attitudes. But what seems inescapable to me is that the idea of marriage as an arrangement between two people, like any other kind of arrangement, got hopelessly entangled with marriage as a religious institution. And maybe I'm getting the order of things backwards there, but it's not really clear to me, sitting here now, why it ever should have been a religious institution. I realize I am biting off a whole lot more than I can chew in one podcast or maybe any. I realize I'm biting off way more than I can chew in one podcast or maybe many, given the subject matter of this particular show and my level of education in these areas, in terms of the way that religion has always been closely involved, for better or worse, with matters of sex and reproduction and marriage. But whether you consider that a good thing or a bad thing, a right thing or a wrong thing, if you're arguing that Joe DiMaggio should stay with Marilyn Monroe, no, let me switch that around, that Marilyn Monroe has a spiritual obligation to stay with Joe DiMaggio after he's slapped her one, or if you're arguing with a couple who has kids that they should stay together on the same basis for the children, you've lost track of the actual suffering of the people in the marriage. And while their staying together may satisfy someone's sense of religious obligation or simply satisfy people outside of that marriage, the couple themselves have been condemned to grapple for the rest of their lives within an institution that is supposed to provide them with mutual happiness, mutual security, mutual support in every facet of their lives, not mutual antipathy, and even danger. And it's naive to say, as Crosby strongly implied with his sentimental note, that perpetuating that condition for the children is automatically beneficial for those children. I think it's more obvious to us now, or at least I'd like to think so, that staying together so as to model a bad relationship for your kids is one of the reasons that abuse is something that persists through generations of the same family. That's a high price to pay for economic stability or to satisfy the deity of your choice. I note a similar idea at work in the same period in Indiana in the 1930s, where Superior Court Judge Benjamin E. Buente had an annual No Divorce Week in his court. During that week, he scheduled no divorce cases and paused the ones already before the bench. Cited as his chief reason for setting No Divorce Week, I quote, was his estimate that 100,000 children annually are involved in American divorces. These children, he asserted, face the peril of a criminal or pauper future. Fair enough, but what kind of future do they face if dad beats mom to death with a tire iron? Same one, right? Or maybe a little worse? Judges and lawyers of the 1930s and 40s, seeing this widely distributed Crosby illustration, said, "Ha ha! This is how we shame people into not getting divorced no more." And they hung it up in their offices and courtrooms. 10 years on, the Hearst papers published a sort of anniversary look at the way the illustration had affected people, with bunches of anecdotes like, in Palmerton, Pennsylvania, while Jose Perez was packing to leave his wife, his eyes fell on this same drawing, and I decided, come what may, I would stick to my children. Good thing they had a copy up in the bedroom. Then there's this one. A feuding couple had married very young. They had a child. The wife called up a lawyer, Mr. Fisher, asking him to start divorce proceedings because, she said, her husband never gave her enough money, he flirted with other women, and he drank. And what is more, he slapped her face during a cocktail party. Apparently, under Wisconsin law, she had grounds for divorce. And when the lawyer called up her husband, he was willing to part with his wife without regrets. But there was the child, and Mr. Fisher thought he'd try the magic picture before dragging the couple to court. After much persuasion, he succeeded in bringing the estranged couple together in his office. Then Mr. Fisher left them together in the room with Crosby's drawing. When he returned, both said that they saw the point. There was no divorce and a home was saved. Since that first case, Mr. Fisher, with the help of a magic talisman, has reconciled more than 500 couples, saved that many homesteads from going on the marital rocks, and assured numberless children a happy future. I'd like to repeat every example like that one because I think they're all damning. I'm no fan of divorce, but I believe that one cannot help children by keeping people who harm each other together, for inevitably they will harm the children as well, either by deed or by example. I saw this in my own life when I was young, not with my parents, who were together roughly 55 years, including in some years when maybe they shouldn't have been, but with other loved ones. When the divorce happened, the shouting stopped, and the quiet, I think, was healthful to all involved. The anniversary piece printed a telegram from Crosby himself to William Randolph Hearst, supposedly in reaction to being shown the stories of the great impact his piece of art had made. He said, "Dear Mr. Hearst, after reading the touching story in the American Weekly today, where my picture of a boy praying saved many marriages from divorce courts, I want you to know that when I created this picture, inclusive of prayer, it never occurred to me it would do so much good for suffering humanity. The soul within me, which is no more than a brother to all souls, prompts me to return the money, for I feel that God wants it that way. Will you see that the $500 I received for the little boy's prayer is distributed among poor little kids and buy them toys and candy, and tell them God will never desert them. As it is written, suffer little children to come unto me. Percy Crosby." Wow. I happen to think that Crosby was one of the great artists of the comic strip, but that is a lot. Hearst or his subordinates did follow his instructions or honor his wishes. They divided the $500 into 10 payments, $50 going further in 1944 than it does now, and gave it away to people in need. Some examples: in Baltimore, pretty 16-year-old Jeanette Buckheimer had to have her right leg amputated. Her triumph over pain and tragedy was heroic. She refused to recognize defeat. She could sing, and her wish was to entertain soldiers if she had a guitar. The Baltimore News-Post and Sunday American bought her the guitar as well as other gifts, much to the delight of the girl. In San Francisco, Johnny's mother and dad had been listed as missing for months, and he was left entirely alone. But the San Francisco Examiner saw to it that he got some new clothes, toys to play with, and candy enough to pass around his playmates. Most of all, this gesture gave him assurance that the world still had good folks to look out for him. We all need that assurance sometimes. Let me close with this. I recently saw the film Blue Moon about the very troubled lyricist Larry Hart. Ethan Hawke is nominated for an Academy Award for playing Larry Hart. It's very good, and it made me very sad because Hart had incredible talent and incredible self-destructiveness in equal measure, which is to say that if you took a ruler to both, they'd each be a mile high, and his story has always moved me terribly, and so does Percy Crosby's. Crosby, too, had incredible talent, but something got loose in his head, paranoia crept in, and alcohol, and maybe big peanut butter as well, and he lost his strip, his property, both physical and intellectual, and not too long after he sent back the $500, he would not only be broke, but suicidal and confined to an institution. His family abandoned him there for the last 20 years of his life, approximately. Did anyone try to get him sprung? Not his wife, not his children. Why? His drinking had caused him to become abusive to his wife, his third wife. He'd been divorced twice, and that second marriage also had similar problems, such that he never saw his children over the last 25 years of his life. And here's a painful irony for you. One of Crosby's daughters, I'm not sure if she's still alive, she'd be well into her 90s now, continued the legal fight around the Skippy trademarks well into this century. She was a product of Crosby's second marriage. In her online biography of her father and history of her litigation, she describes his third wife, Carolyn, as an opportunist and implies that she was complicit in his permanent institutionalization and the looting of his estate, which is to say, he should have gotten divorced a third time, no matter what his drawing said. In the illustration he drew for the American Weekly, above the praying boy's head are the framed words, "Be it ever so humble, there's no place like home." He found out the truth of those words, but he didn't know it when he drew them. When you come to the borders of this grayest of dimensions, the phrase that will gain you entry is, "Do as I say, not as I do." Better yet, just ignore me altogether. I'm all out of helpful suggestions. We swear by these and other Fowler mottos here in the depths of the infinite inning. Well, hello there, and welcome back to the show, Infinite Inning number 364. I am, as ever, your convivial host. They call me Stephen Goldman, and I will be your companion on this trip to the past to better understand the present, the time machine as ever being, for the most part, the game of baseball, which is very often, though not always, a microcosm of the way we live at any moment in time. I'll tell you, though, I'm not sure it has anything to offer us at this precise moment in time. As I speak these words, it is 3:48 a.m. on February 28th, 2026. Yes, it's an odd time to be awake and recording a podcast, but I've always kept odd hours, and I've been dealing with insomnia this week and really kind of screwed my life up because I did what I know not to do, which is to just stay in bed and insist that I'm going to fall asleep, tossing and turning and turning and tossing and trying to resist the urge to pick up the phone or a book and saying to myself that any moment now, those chemicals that send one off to dreamland are going to do their job. And no, it didn't. So I'd end up sleeping at the wrong hours and then not having any work done. So I'm running way behind. By chemicals, I don't mean that I take sleeping pills or anything. I just mean those neurochemicals that are part of the process of the human body going to sleep. This is not the first time that I've been here. It is not the first time I've felt spectacularly frustrated by my body's own recalcitrance, and it probably won't be the last time. Eventually, it somehow straightens itself out, and I get to live like a real grown-up boy for a while, at least until the next time that my body refuses to fall asleep. My mother tells me I've always been like this, even as a baby, and I can remember being in nursery school, and after snack time, they'd say, "Okay, boys and girls, now it's nap time," and they'd get out cots and blankets and stuff, and I'd think, damn it, because I knew that I was the one toddler or whatever I was at that age that would not be falling asleep for however long they intended us to, but they wouldn't let me do anything to fill the time either. So cue 20 minutes of staring at the ceiling. Thank you so much. But what's unique about this moment is that as I began talking here, I got notice that we are now at war with Iran. And I had a decision to make. It was literally the moment that I went to press the big red button that starts the podcast recording. Do I throw out my notes and just kind of speak extemporaneously on that? Because frankly, that's what's on my mind at the moment. And I thought, no, let's give the folks the show that they came to see. And so after this interstitial segment, I will have a straight baseball story for you. And not one that is particularly political in any way. I hope it's an uplifting story. It was just one that struck me as fun for this particular episode. But I'll tell you that even as I am going to proceed and tell you that story, that, well, what I am is worried. I'm worried for our men and women in the armed forces who are now in jeopardy. I'm worried for those civilians who are going to be caught in the fallout of this on both sides. I'm worried for our democratic process because this is not how the United States is supposed to go to war. I am worried because wars always, in terms of the homeland, always lead to the further suppression of civil liberties. And I guarantee you that that's going to be next, because this administration is not tolerant of dissent. I'm upset because I don't know why they're doing this. And although the president has said that they're a week away from building an intercontinental ballistic missile or what have you, fact by assertion is not the same as fact, particularly coming from that individual. I worry because his stated intention is to decapitate, overthrow the regime. And if that doesn't work purely by air power, which has not ever worked, then, well, they're going to be very incentivized to be 1 week away from building an ICBM to complete that week, because you think they don't understand why we don't bully North Korea? And not only will bad guys over there be empowered if this attack does not succeed in its objectives, but warhawks here will feel obligated to send in actual soldiers, and Iran is almost as large as Iraq and Afghanistan combined. I suppose you saw how well that went, and it's hard to feel sanguine about our accomplishing much more than getting a lot of our young people killed. Not to mention, even if you win, how are you going to pacify a country of over 90 million people? Oh, we won't try? Then who will take over? Fun party types friendly to the U.S. Oh, we'll be greeted as liberators. I've never heard that one before. You sure you won't trade out crazy hardliners for even crazier hardliners? Because it's been known to happen. Anyway, we've just launched a war of aggression. Democracies aren't supposed to do that, but then we may not be that right now either. So back to baseball. The sad thing is, part of my insomnia has been that I've been struggling with the news. I'm not thrilled, and this is a minor thing given tonight's news, that Superman will probably be in the hands of people who will change his essential nature so that instead of being the ultimate immigrant and someone who, going back to his earliest days, fought the Klan and wife beaters and so on, will now be fighting for them. And that's a small thing, I suppose, but just like Skippy, that's something that I really, really care about. That's been important to me, like Crazy Cat and Elsie Seeger Popeyes and Peanuts, and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And forgive me, ladies and gentlemen, but it's just very hard to watch the world that you love and have lived in under assault and probably dying. I hope that the second act will give you the opposite message, one of hope. We'll get to that in just a second. This week at Baseball Prospectus, I wrote about the Angels and a false dichotomy set up by owner Artie Moreno, who last week strongly suggested one could have a safe and affordable ballpark, or one could have a winning team. Not both. And finally, for those of you who haven't joined me over at Patreon yet, this week's Dead Players of the Day included outfielder Eddie Milner of Reds fame, the slugging Tigers second baseman Dick McAuliffe, the 19th century shortstop Jack Glasscock. Don't snicker. That one was a lot of fun to write, actually. And finally, another St. Louis player. Jack spent some time in St. Louis as well. The outfielder, Baby Doll Jacobson. And speaking of St. Louis, I have a story to tell you about a pitcher whose best years came in St. Louis in the 1930s, but oh boy, did he go through some difficulties before he got there, and I will tell you all about that right after this brief intermission. I think I structured this episode kind of backwards from the way I usually do. I try to put the shorter story at the front and the longer story at the back. And I think the way things worked out, I didn't plan it this way, but I spoke longer than I intended to at the outset. And this second segment may not turn out to be all that long, but I do think it's sort of happy in its way. So I hope that will make up for any brevity of this episode. Sometimes the universe is trying to send us a message about what it is that we're attempting to do. One of the top prospects presently trying to win a job with the Cleveland Guardians, in fact, is outfielder Chase DeLauder. He was the club's first-round pick back in 2022. He's a center fielder, maybe. He has obvious ability for sure. Add up all his minor league work to date, and you get 138 games of hitting .302 with a .384 on-base percentage and a .504 slugging percentage. That includes 40 doubles and 20 home runs and 70 walks. I like that. The problem is that he's compiled those numbers over 3 years. Divide 138 games by 3, you get 46. He gets hurt a lot. He got hurt a lot in college, too. I imagine he got hurt a decent amount in high school. And there's no doubt a fluke quality to certain injuries. No one has a predisposition to having a piano fall on them, although when you hear this story, you might feel differently about the pitcher in question. But the durability to perform in an athletic competition on a daily basis, as baseball demands, seems to be as much a genetic trait as fast twitch reflexes and sharp eyesight. We don't notice that because all the kids who don't have that trait probably washed out in the Little League. Think back to a player as recent as the Twins' first baseman and outfielder Alex Kirilloff, also a first-round draft pick. In his case, he was selected in 2016. He murdered the ball in the minors, hitting .324, .380, .534 in 337 games. Now, what he did in the majors bore little resemblance to that, at least in part because he could never stay in the lineup long enough to get going. Simultaneously, the specific nature of his injuries, which were primarily to the arm and wrist, but eventually also included the back and shoulder, were eroding his ability to do the things that got him to the majors in the first place. The final blow was spondylolisthesis. Let me try that again. Spondylolisthesis, a kind of collapse of the vertebrae of the lumbar spine. Far be it from me to make fun of that, by the way. That was a legitimate slip of the tongue. I exaggerated it a little bit at the end once I realized I was about to go very, very wrong. But I've had lumbar back pain so bad that it was a struggle to breathe, so believe me, I empathize. Having dealt with that in November of 2024, Kirilloff saw the writing on the wall and he retired. He was only 27. This is a much more common fate for the athlete than we tend to acknowledge, just because we're used to looking at the narrow end of the funnel. We don't see how many players enter from the larger side. The Guardians hope that DeLauder can somehow get past that, and so do we all. Think, too, of Barry Larkin. For a while, he couldn't stay on the field. I remember Bill James writing, "The only thing he can't do is stay healthy." Well, like I said, that's true of some players. In his case, he got through it and made it all the way through to the Hall of Fame. Now I have a pitcher who falls somewhere in between that I'd like to tell you about. This is the tale of 1920s and 30s pitcher Sylvester Johnson. It's almost comical in this regard. Syl was born in Portland, Oregon on the last day of the year 1900. A side-arming right-hander, he got his start playing sandlot and semi-pro ball, but he was a catcher at first. Then a foul ball knocked out a bunch of his teeth and he decided it would be safer elsewhere. He was kind of wrong about that. He had his first professional season in 1920, and by 1922, he had been signed by Ty Cobb's Tigers. When I say Cobb's Tigers, I don't just mean it was the era of Cobb and he still was playing there. He was also the manager. The deal the Tigers made with Johnson's club, the Portland Beavers of the Pacific Coast League, showed that they valued him as a major prospect. They dealt 8 players to be named and $30,000 or $40,000, depending on who you read, in return for Syl Johnson's contract. The problem was that, at least as far as his Tigers phase was concerned, Johnson ended up in a similar position to Alex Kirilloff. During spring training of 1922, his first with the Tigers, a line drive up the middle hit him in the right wrist, breaking it. He had enough time left in the spring that his major league debut was delayed only to the 10th game of the season, but his debut as a starting pitcher was further delayed because he hadn't had time to win a job. Cobb kept him in the bullpen until August. So that's that, right? Why even mention it? Because this was just the beginning of Syl Johnson's troubles. He was a pincushion. That season, he also took a line drive off his elbow, was disabled by bronchitis, and required a tonsillectomy. But wait, there's more. His 1923 and 24 seasons were kind of quiet except for torn elbow ligaments, another comebacker off the previously broken wrist that aggravated the injury, a leg damaged by yet another comebacker, and a serious sinus infection. And then came May 29th, 1925. The Tigers were facing the White Sox in Chicago. Hooks Doss started for the Tigers and held the Sox, a 500-ish team that year, to 4 runs through 8 innings as the Tigers beat the heck out of White Sox starter Sloppy Thurston and 2 relievers. With the Tigers up 13-4 going to the bottom of the 9th, Cobb chose to let Doss have the rest of the afternoon to himself and called Johnson in from the bullpen. It was a slow game, a long game by the standards of the day, and no doubt Hooks was gassed. This turned out to be a very bad idea. It went wrong in all kinds of ways. First, the minor problem for Syl Johnson was he had next to no stuff that day. He gave up hits to the first 2 batters he faced, got 1 out, and then gave up a 3-run homer to utility man Bill Barrett, who hit all of 23 of them in a 9-year career, and then he walked the batter after that, Earl Shealy. Cobb might have been taking a nap at this point, I don't know. I guess he assumed that Johnson couldn't possibly blow a 9-run lead. That brought up hard-hitting Texan Bib Falk, the subject of a prior episode of this show. Bib, real name Bib, did in fact hit the ball hard, off of Johnson's face. Here's how Harry Bullion of the Detroit Free Press described it in that day's game story. Johnson served up a fastball that Falk met squarely and, like a bullet, sent it back at the pitcher who, his head partly turned with the momentum of his delivery, couldn't get his hands up for protection. The ball hit Sylvester in the left cheekbone. In the temple or forehead, the blow might have instantly killed a young pitcher. As though shot in the brain, Johnson collapsed limply on the sod behind the pitching mound. The rest of the players rushed around the stricken athlete and carried him partway to the tunnel leading to the clubhouse, and he walked the rest of the way to it. But upon entering the White Sox dugout, which leads to the dressing room, Johnson collapsed again, and his mates were obliged to carry him. Immediate treatment at the hospital and an X-ray revealed a fracture of the left cheekbone in 5 places. While the pitcher's face was only slightly cut on the outside, it was badly disfigured, and he bled profusely from the mouth. Frank O'Rourke, George Doss, and Secretary Lou McCarty, who accompanied Johnson to the hospital, reported that his vitality was low from loss of blood. Johnson later said it was 8 broken bones. Here's the part that really gets me. Once he got out of the hospital, Cobb sent him down to the Pacific Coast League. He left him there the rest of the year, too. Although you can't totally blame him because Johnson pitched pretty poorly. He went 3-17 with a .466 ERA for the Vernon Tigers. That said, the guy probably couldn't even see straight, possibly was concussed, and you could kind of pretend that Cobb meant it as an extended rehab assignment, and yet it just seems odd that, well, not odd, but ugly that the manager was such a warm and tender guy that he sent the only get well card in history that read, "Glad you're not dead, get better quickly, and when you do, please report to an industrial zone just outside of Los Angeles because we don't want you around anymore." Just to clarify that. I made up the greeting card. I'm saying that that was tantamount to what Cobb did. And also, I have to take some time to figure out why the PCL chose to locate a team in Vernon, because as I understand things, it was and is pretty much exclusively an industrial park. The population peaked in 1930 at about 1,300 and is presently around 200. I think the answer is probably simply adjacent to Los Angeles, but cheaper. And yet, you look at modern photos of the place and they look like the way Jack Kirby drew Apocalypse. I guess there was a window in there when it hadn't yet been wholly paved over, and there was still some grass growing, and I guess some well-intentioned entrepreneurs were trying to lure people out of the bigger town into the smaller town, to the extent that it was a town. Well, that ended Syl Johnson's. I'm confusing him with the late head of the family, Stone, clearly. And what did they have in common? Hot fun in the summertime, at least when they weren't being peppered by baseballs. Let me try that again. That ended Syl Johnson's stay with the Tigers. That fall, Branch Rickey's Cardinals took him in the Rule 5 draft. It wasn't a bad gamble. Johnson had been a league average swingman between injuries, and teams can always use another pitcher like that. He had even led the American League in strikeout rate in 1923, albeit with 4 and change, and it worked out for a minute. Johnson broke camp in 1926 as the Cardinals' number 4 starter. He had barely begun when, in his 4th start of the season, Reds first baseman Wally Pipp lined a ball off of his foot and broke a toe. He sat about 3 weeks, wound up back in the bullpen. In late August, he took a line drive off of his left non-pitching arm in a game, which, well, it hurt, but it didn't stop him. And then he had a metacarpal in his right hand fractured when a teammate, Bob O'Farrell, ultimately the league MVP, lined a ball back at him in batting practice. The Cardinals sent him home and went on to win the World Series without him. The next spring, shades of Ty Cobb, they sent him to Syracuse for almost the entire season, presumably to learn how to duck. But you know, whatever it was, the lesson finally took. By 1928, he was already 27, but he stuck for a while after that. He did manage to avoid those comebackers. From then through 1931, 4-year span, he was a key pitcher on the Cards, going 44-30 with a 3.78 ERA, which was well below or above, depending on how you want to put it, league average. He developed excellent control, and in 31 led the National League in fewest walks per 9 innings with 1.4. He pitched for 3 Cardinals pennant winners in those years. In 1931, picking up his second ring, or whatever it was they got his prizes. The ring thing wasn't settled yet. Sometimes they got watches or once guns because, you know, America. He slipped in 1933 and 34, so the Cardinals traded him out and he missed the 1934 championship, but he did have a third wind coming, primarily with the Phillies. The poor guy, he pitched in a terrible park for terrible teams, but in all, he had 19 seasons in the big leagues. He won 112 games with a roughly league average ERA. His career wins above replacement was 27.4, which is not historic in any sense, but out of the totality of all pitchers is pretty great, particularly one who had as many setbacks. So many setbacks, they were calling him baseball's tough luck pitcher. There's no great lesson here, except simply this. Whatever you're facing now, whatever we're facing now, it might get better. Just look at Syl Johnson. And no, he didn't get hit by a car as soon as he retired. He lived past his 84th birthday. So keep punching, keep hoping, do everything you can to change your life and our collective lives for the better. That's the most I can offer on a morning like this one. And hey, it's February 28th, not December 7th, but let's remember Pearl Harbor. That was the day that the United States, in contentious negotiations with a foreign power, saw those negotiations terminated by a sudden and unprovoked attack. Today, we were the ones who terminated a negotiation with a sudden and unprovoked attack. It's funny how things change, isn't it? One good thing that happened for Syl Johnson in getting out of the American League, he got away from Babe Ruth. Ruth, in his career against Syl, 11 for 21, that's a .524 average, with 3 doubles, a triple, and 4 home runs. Should you wish to hit a home run by following me on social media, you can do so at stephengoldman.bsky.social. You can write us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com, and there remains a Facebook group. I put that Percy Crosby cover I discussed at the outset of the episode up there so you can see what it is we were talking about. Should you wish to support the show, and I very much hope you do, please visit patreon.com/theinfiniteinning. Gear of a rudimentary kind available at the-infinite-inning.creator-spring.com. Original soundtrack available gratis at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, whistle a little George M. Cohan tune, something like Over There. It's due to be coming back into fashion. And speaking of theme songs, our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who says, "You know something that's always been even better than divorce at throwing children into economic uncertainty? Being orphaned by a war. Funny how no one ever thinks of that as a reason to just stay home." Well, as Percy Crosby drew way back in 1935, be it ever so humble, there's no place like home. And let's hope that all of us remain safe in ours, and that's true of all children and adults worldwide. And if that remains the case, I'll be back next week with more tales from inside the infinite inning.